may have noticed that there's an election coming up. And throughout history, there have been a number of occasions where individuals have been afforded the right to voice their opinion in the form of a vote. In 1776, in a discussion over what would be the official language of the United States, English won out over German by one vote. In 1800, it was one vote that kept Aaron Burr from becoming president. One vote that elected Thomas Jefferson. It was by a single vote that the states of Texas, California, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho were admitted to the Union. In 1868, it was one vote that saved President Andrew Johnson from impeachment. There are other occasions throughout the history of our country where we see this same phenomena that takes place. And yet when we go to the polls to cast a vote, it might be easy for us to say, well, my vote is insignificant. My vote is of no importance. My vote can't really reveal itself in the determination of the election. In Luke, the 3rd chapter and verse 2, in his characteristic way of writing, recording the history of Jesus, and later in Acts, the history of the church, Luke enjoys providing us a context, an historical context, a frame of reference, if you will, for what he's writing. And he does that in Luke chapter 3 and verse 2, where he says, while Annas and Caiaphas were high priests, the word of God came to John, the son of Zacharias, in the wilderness. Now, being familiar with the Old Testament system, priestly system, the high priesthood, the Levites, it might strike you as odd that Luke would tell us that at the time that John began his public ministry, there were 2 high priests, not just one. Well, the fact of the matter is that when it came to their spiritual leadership, the Jews of the first century had no voice at all. The determination of who would serve as high priest over the Jewish nation was reserved to the decision of the Roman government under which they lived. The fact of the matter is, Annas served as high priest from AD 6 to AD 15. After Annas was removed by the Romans from the capacity of the high priest, he was succeeded by 5 of his sons, eventually by a son-in-law, Caiaphas. Caiaphas served as high priest from AD 26 to 37. And so during the time frame that Luke is discussing, during the ministry of John the Baptist and then the earthly ministry of Jesus, the official recognized high priest of the Jewish nation was Caiaphas, as far as the Romans were concerned. But the Jews knew who was really in control. And though Annas no longer served in the official capacity of high priest, Luke recognizes that he was operating in that role nonetheless. He may not have had the title officially in the eyes of the Romans, but in the eyes of the Jews, Annas was still their high priest. There are 5 Roman emperors that are mentioned or alluded to in the New Testament. In Luke chapter 2 and verse 1, we meet the first one, a man by the name of Augustus, Octavius. And it came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. Octavian, or Augustus, was a man who was highly esteemed by Romans. And yet, though he is generally referred to and seen in a positive light, even by historians, when Augustus Caesar wanted something, nothing stood in his way to achieve that. He wanted some land, he took it. Up to 300 senators and 2,000 of the wealthy Romans lost their property by a simple whim of Augustus Caesar. Resist and you die. The second Caesar that is referred to is in Luke chapter 3 and verse 1. Now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Tiberius is referred to by Tacitus, a Roman historian, saying of Tiberius, he plunged into every wickedness and disgrace. When fear and shame being cast off, he simply indulged his own inclinations. In the eyes of many of the Romans, Tiberius was held in great esteem. And yet, Tiberius had this same weakness, perhaps amplified. It's ramped up a little bit more in Acts 11, verses 27 through 30, when we come to the reign of Claudius Caesar. And this is during the time of Paul's ministry. Tiberius is described by Romans who were contemporary with him and historians who were close and familiar with his reign as bloodthirsty and cruel, overly fond of gladiatorial combat and executions, and very quick in anger. In Acts 25 and verse 11, though he is not mentioned by name, when Paul stood before the governor Festus and appealed to Caesar, the Caesar to whom he appealed was Nero. You don't have to be very familiar with Roman history, even first century history, to know that Nero was, in many ways, the embodiment of evil. He murdered his mother. He murdered his first wife. He is widely believed to have murdered his second wife. He put to death anybody, family, friends, acquaintance, who he began to feel threatened, that his position may be threatened. He had them executed. Rome caught on fire in AD 64. Most historians are in complete agreement that Nero set the fire. He wanted to expand his palace. There was a slum area that was kind of in his way. The fire was set, it spread, got out of control. Nero blamed the fire on Christians, because Christians, after all, prophesied that the end of the world would come in a fiery destruction, Obviously, Christians are the ones that set the fire. And we see an onset of a severe persecution against Christians. Tacitus, again writing of Nero, said, besides being put to death, Christians were made to serve as objects of amusement. They were clothed in the hides of beasts and torn to death by dogs. Others were crucified. Others set on fire to serve to illuminate the night when the daylight failed. Nero is credited with the martyrdom of both Peter and the Apostle Paul. The book of Revelation is a book that's widely disputed on many planes, one of that being the time in which it was written. I believe that the best evidence points to the book of Revelation being penned around 96 AD. And so the Roman emperor that would be foremost in the book of Revelation is Domitian. Domitian also had a wide reputation for violence, especially in the latter part of his reign. And one of the groups that fell to his displeasure were the Christians. And so when you read through the book of Revelation and you read about the Roman emperor in the various ways that he is portrayed, Domitian is the one that's most likely pictured. But here is the point. When it came to their spiritual leadership, the Jews had absolutely no vote, no voice in who would serve in that capacity. When it came to their political leadership, Christians in the first century did not have a vote. They did not have a voice in who would serve in the capacity of their leadership. Christians today, you and I, living in the United States of America, because of the nation in which we are citizens, we do have a vote. We do have a voice. How do we exercise the right that we have as citizens in a way that is consistent with our faith as Christians? There are three principles, I think, that can outline this topic. And I think they all three are represented in what Paul had to say to the Corinthian church in the 9th chapter. And so if you turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 4 through 6, Paul is reflecting upon his rights attributed to him as an apostle of Jesus Christ. He says in verse 4, "Do we have no right to eat and drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do also the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas or Peter? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working?" Paul, in this passage, is talking about his freedom to make a choice. When we think about our rights as American citizens, by a simple definition of what a right entails, it involves the making of a choice. And so Paul says in these verses, I have certain rights, as an apostle of Jesus Christ. I have the right to bring along a wife, just as the other apostles and the Lord's brothers. I have the right to not hold down a secular job so that I can devote myself to the responsibilities of an apostle. I have a right. But Paul says in these verses that the discretion of how I use those rights are left up to my own individual choice. And so, if I eat or drink, it's my choice. It doesn't violate any law. It doesn't create any sin. Paul was single, but if he had a wife, he could have brought her along on his missionary travels. If he had done so, he would not have sinned. He wouldn't have violated any law. It was a right. He has a privilege of choice. He has the discretion to decide. And so we see Paul with his rights. When you look down a little bit further in this chapter, we come to verse 19, where Paul says, "Though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more." To me, this verse is very telling. It's very telling because it gives us an insight into Paul's thinking, where we see Paul wrestling with, how do I implement my rights? When do I decide to assert my right, and when do I decide to withhold my right? And we see that Paul is operating on a completely different plane from the world around him. And so we come to verse 23, where Paul says, "Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you." And so we go to this passage that Jimmy read for us this morning from 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And we see Paul as he looks at the various groups that he has to interact with as he carries on his ministry. And we see him as he looks at each of these groups, and he looks at his rights, his privileges as an apostle, and he makes a decision about how he's going to implement his rights, his freedom of choice on how he's going to conduct himself. And he says, "To the Jews, I became a Jew. To those who are under the law, I became as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law." You see, there is a deeper motivation that Paul is tapping into as he makes his choices on how I'm going to implement my rights as an apostle. And in verse 23, he's telling us that his end game, his gauge that he is using in making his choices, is that when all is said and done, he can share in the benefits of the gospel. See, Paul's not making his decisions on prejudicial judgments. He's making his decisions on how his choices impact the church of Jesus Christ. We live in a nation where voting is a right. You and I have the discretion, the ability to choose whether to implement that right, or if we choose to implement it, how we choose to employ it. No one can force us. No one can compel us. No one can make us do something against our own will. It's a right that we choose to implement. Paul says also in this setting that as he looked at those in verse 21 who are without law, he says, I became as one who was without law. But then he puts in this caveat, this parenthetical statement in verse 21. Not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ. Again, he's cluing us in on something that I think is very important to keep in mind as we think about implementing our rights as American citizens. Paul recognized that he was under a higher law than any political entity or any human government system. So we might think somewhere along the line, religion and politics, they don't really mix. And yet there are areas in which they certainly do mix. For example, Christians are commanded in Romans 13:1 to be subject to governing authorities. And so you and I are commanded to submit to the powers that be, to submit to governing authorities. Now, unlike the privilege or the right to vote, which is left to our discretion, our choice, the choice about whether or not we submit to the governing powers is not up for discussion. That decision's already been made for us. The choice that we have now when it comes to submitting to physical governments is, are we going to obey God or not? And so we have the idea of choice when it comes to right, but when it comes to commandments, we have an obligation. We have the obligation to submit ourselves to governing authorities. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13. Peter says, therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors. And so we have a command to submit to the government. Of course, there is again a caveat that is built in, and we see this especially expressed in the book of Acts. During the early days of the Lord's church, when the church was experiencing great persecution from Jewish authorities, and when the apostles, Peter and John, were brought before the authorities and were commanded by these men to cease and desist your preaching about Jesus Christ. And in Acts chapter 4, verses 19 and 20, we see the response from these apostles to that charge. But Peter and John answered and said to them, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you more than to God, you judge. For we cannot but speak the things which we have seen and heard. The very same response is given in the next chapter, chapter 5, verses 27 through 29. And so what can we carry away from that? We carry away from that a prioritization. Yes, we have an obligation, a responsibility as Christians to submit to governing authorities. In as far as those governing authorities do not conflict and contradict our higher authority of obedience to God. And so, say a law is passed that blatantly outlaws a practice that is prescribed by God for the Lord's church. What do? Do we obey God's command, or do we obey the ordinance of man? Christians are commanded to submit to the political powers that be, but only in as far as that submitting does not contradict a commandment by God. And so we are motivated by a higher authority. Christians are commanded to support the government. Romans 13 and verse 6. For because of this you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers attending continually to this very thing. We support the government by our taxes. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, we support the government by our prayers. Therefore I exhort first of all that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings and all who are in authority, that they may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence. And so when we see ourselves in a political environment, we recognize that we as Christians and as American citizens have certain rights and privileges. We have the freedom to choose how to implement, if to implement, those rights, those privileges. There are consequences that come, but we have the choice. But we have, above everything else, the responsibility to keep a spiritual perspective and to ask ourselves, what can I do that can further the cause of Christ? What can I do that can help the church to be most effective in carrying out its mission of taking the good news of Jesus into all the world? The society in which we live has drifted so far from biblical values and morals. But when you look at the New Testament, that's not such a big surprise, because we have predictions that the world will drift further and further away from Christ and from the values that Christ inspires in the New Testament. But we are citizens of heaven, above and beyond being citizens of this nation. And so, the real question for us is not so much who our nation will declare winner of an election on November 8, or who's going to be sitting in the Oval Office on January 21st. As far as you and I are concerned, our mission is still the same. The church is still the church of God, the body of Christ, and our obligation to carry the gospel into all the world will be just as authoritative as it is today. Will my vote influence the world? Well, it is kind of hard to see that a single solitary vote can have a great impact and influence on the world. But there is something you and I can do to change the world. And I think we're already doing it. First, to believe in Jesus. And second, to behave like Christians.
Amen.
Because when it comes to saving the world, there's only one who can do that. And that's Jesus. And so we have an obligation. You know, we look at looking for the perfect candidate. Well, there is no perfect candidate ever that can lead this nation, because everyone is afflicted with this thing of humanity. So we won't find a perfect person to do that. But when it comes to furthering the cause of Christ, when it comes to leading exemplary lives in a world of sin, there is a perfect candidate to do that. And that's you and I. Because we are positioned as children of God. And we are commissioned as children of God to carry the message of Christ to the world. And if we don't do it, who will? God is counting on us. Counting on us to be good citizens, but more than that, counting on us to be good Christians, to be an influence of good in a world of evil, to be people of light in a world of darkness. That's our commission. And we have been given the greatest message to share. And no matter what happens in this world in which we live, no matter what happens in this country in which we live, we still have the honor of holding up that message and sharing and reflecting that light into the world. God's counting on you. He's counting on me. This morning, how is your relationship with God? If you have drifted away from God, why not this morning come back? Come back and be the light that Christ wants you to be. If you have never accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord in baptism, why not this morning? Why not let this morning be the beginning of your new life as a child of God? If you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, please come as we stand and sing.
Sinners Jesus will receive.